Watching this video, the United States government is spending $83,720 every single second on something that produces nothing. No roads, no hospitals, no military hardware, no teachers' salaries, just interest. In fiscal year 2025, the United States paid $1.22 trillion in gross interest on its national debt. That is more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare, more than every dollar spent on education, transportation, and veterans benefits combined. And next year, it gets worse. $1 trillion in interest every year, forever, and growing. This is not a warning about the future, this is the present, and yet almost nobody is talking about it. Today, we are.
I have a friend who loves to say, the debt doesn't matter, who cares? But you and I both know the truth that the debt does matter very much.
Well, I guess if you are worried about debts, and that is the federal budget deficit will exceed the size of the entire American economy, debt to GDP will trump.
To understand why this moment is different, you need to understand what changed, not just in the size of the debt, but in its cost. Here is the timeline that most media coverage skips. In 2015, the US paid $223 billion in annual interest on its debt. That was manageable, roughly 6% of federal spending. In 2020, at the start of the pandemic, that number was $345 billion. Still significant, but the interest rate on US debt was barely 1.5%, near historic lows. The government was borrowing cheaply, and economists largely agreed the debt was sustainable. Then two things happened simultaneously, and this is where the trap was set. First, the debt exploded. Pandemic stimulus, infrastructure spending, and the 2025 One Big Beautiful Bill, which extended the 2017 tax cuts and added an estimated $3.4 trillion to the 10-year deficit, pushed total gross national debt to nearly $39 trillion by early 2026. That is an increase of $13 trillion in just 5 years. Second, interest rates rose sharply. The Federal Reserve hiked rates aggressively to fight post-pandemic inflation. The average interest rate on US debt, which sat at just 1.55% in 2022, climbed above 3.35% by 2025. It more than doubled in 3 years. When you combine a much larger debt with much higher interest rates, the result is not additive, it is multiplicative. The interest bill did not double. Between 2020 and 2025, it nearly tripled, from $345 billion to $970 billion in net interest, with gross interest surpassing $1.22 trillion in fiscal year 2025 alone. That is the trap, and here is the part that makes it genuinely different from every previous debt debate this country has had.
Treasuries carry hardly any risk, so whenever the economic outlook is bad, investors flock to the relative safety of treasuries. When it looks like a recession,
here is the mechanism that most coverage completely misses, and it is the reason this crisis is structurally different. When the US government borrows money, it issues Treasury bonds, essentially IOUs, at whatever the prevailing interest rate is at the time. Those bonds have a maturity date, 2 years, 10 years, 30 years. When they mature, the government has to roll them over, issue new bonds to replace the old ones. Here is the critical detail. In May 2015, the US Treasury sold a 10-year bond at a yield of 2.24%. That bond matured in 2025. To replace it, the Treasury sold a new 10-year bond at 4.34%, nearly doubled the interest cost. And the size of the issue? It had also nearly doubled, from $24 billion to $42 billion. That is just one bond. Now scale that across trillions of dollars of debt maturing every year. During the low-rate era of 2020 and 2021, the US Treasury issued enormous volumes of short-term debt, bills, notes at rates near zero. As that debt matured between 2025 and 2026, the government was forced to refinance it at rates 4 to 5 times higher. Analysts have called this the refinancing cliff, and it has turned the federal budget into a machine that borrows money primarily to pay for the cost of borrowing money. In the first 9 weeks of fiscal year 2026 alone, the Treasury paid $104 billion in interest. That is more than $11 billion per week before a single dollar was spent on any government program. And crucially, even if the Federal Reserve cuts rates, even if the government stops adding to the debt entirely, this refinancing dynamic means the average interest rate paid on existing debt will keep rising for years. Old cheap debt continues to expire, new expensive debt replaces it, the clock does not reset. This is not a political problem waiting for the right politician, it is a mathematical one. Here is the question that should be keeping every policymaker awake at night. If we are spending over $1 trillion a year just on interest, what are we not spending it on? Economists call this crowding out, and it operates on 2 levels. At the federal level, it means that interest payments are now the 3rd largest line item in the entire US budget, behind only Social Security and Medicare. It already outpaces defense. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2036, interest costs will consume 1/4 of all federal revenue. Every 4th dollar of taxes collected will go straight to the creditors before funding a single program, hiring a single federal employee, or building a single road. Over the next decade, the United States is projected to spend $16.2 trillion on interest alone. That is $4.3 trillion more than the nation will spend on its entire defense budget over the same period. But the second level of crowding out is where it gets personal. When the US government borrows at scale, it competes with every private borrower in the country for the same pool of available capital. That competition pushes interest rates higher for everyone.
Are way up. And since there's a supply shortage, it's just getting worse and worse. Goodbye, American dream.
Higher mortgage rates, higher car loans, higher credit card rates, higher rates for the businesses that create jobs. The government's debt does not stay inside the government's budget. It bleeds into your budget through the interest rate channel quietly every month. A Yale Budget Lab analysis confirmed that ballooning federal debt contributes to sustained inflation pressure and elevated borrowing costs across all sectors of the economy. The government's interest problem is not abstract. It is the reason your mortgage is more expensive than it would otherwise be.
The international credit agency Moody's downgraded the U.S.'s credit rating from its highest AAA rating to AA1.
You might reasonably ask, if this is so serious, why is Washington not in crisis mode? The honest answer is that the US has a unique structural advantage, and it has created a dangerous complacency. Because US Treasury bonds are the world's reserve safe haven asset, the government has always been able to borrow at lower rates than any other nation on earth. Investors have always believed the US would pay its debts. That belief has allowed successive administrations to run deficits that would have triggered crises in any other country. But that advantage is starting to show cracks. In May 2025, Moody's stripped the United States of its last remaining AAA credit rating, citing the rising debt burden and the government's inability to demonstrate a credible path to fiscal sustainability. It was a symbolic moment, but not just symbolic. It signals that the global confidence premium the US has long enjoyed is no longer unconditional. And here is the number that should concern every investor watching this. By 2036, under the CBO's current baseline, interest payments will consume 1/4 of all federal revenue. Under the more pessimistic scenario modeled by the Committees for a Responsible Federal Budget, where interest rates stay elevated and temporary spending provisions are made permanent, that figure climbs to 1/3. A government that spends 1/3 of its revenue on past debt has almost no capacity to respond to the next crisis, no fiscal firepower for the next pandemic, the next war, the next financial collapse. Former Republican Senator Mitt Romney, not someone given to progressive fiscal hand-wringing, called the situation a genuine emergency in late 2025, writing in the New York Times that the combination of solutions will require difficult choices that Washington has so far refused to make. Let us go back to that clock. By the time you finish watching this video, roughly 20 minutes, the United States will have added approximately $100 million to its interest tab. Not its debt, just the interest on the debt. The politicians who debate this issue are not lying when they express concern. They are lying, or at least deeply mistaken, when they imply the problem is manageable without serious action. Because the trap is not in the debt itself, it is in the compounding mechanism that connects the debt to the interest rate, to the refinancing cliff, to the crowding out effect. Each dollar of new deficit makes the next dollar of interest more expensive, and the government has been adding roughly $7 billion to the debt every single day for the past year. The CBO projects net interest costs will rise from $970 billion today to $2.1 trillion by 2036. That is not a projection built on catastrophic assumptions, it's the base case, the if nothing changes scenario. The responsible federal budget watchdogs note that under a more adverse scenario, interest payments could approach $2.2 trillion, consuming more than a quarter of every tax dollar collected. Here is the contrarian insight this story demands. The US debt crisis is not like the crises that have come before it. Previous debt surges, World War II, the 1980s Reagan deficits, the post-2008 stimulus, occurred when interest rates were falling or when rates were already low. The debt grew, but its cost was contained. This time, the debts grew and rates rose simultaneously. And now, the refinancing mechanism means the bill keeps climbing even in a world of stable rates. There is no easy exit. The clock on that wall is not a metaphor, it is a ledger, and right now, it is winning.